Please welcome Dr. Brett Parris.
So let me begin by emphasising that climate change is fundamentally a development problem, not simply an environmental problem. The environmental costs of greenhouse gas pollution have not been incorporated into the prices we've paid for coal, oil and natural gas for the last 200 years. We now have to correct that mistake. We now have to take account of the very real cost of greenhouse gas emissions. Rather than cursing the imposition of higher prices, we should instead be thankful that for so long we've been subsidised by the forests, the atmosphere and the oceans. Our Earth absorbed so much of our waste for so long, but now it's gagging, choking on our effluent. Like all unsustainable, market-distorting subsidies, our failure to pay the true costs of our emissions had to come to an end. For well over a century, people didn't realise the damage they were causing, so we can't fault our forebears. But the writing's been on the wall for all to see for almost 20 years. In May 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in its first assessment, stressed the need for, and I quote, immediate reductions in emissions from human activities of over 60% to stabilise their concentrations at today's levels, end quote. That warning was issued in 1990, 18 years ago. Yet now our big industrial emitters are demanding compensation, as though the need for emissions reductions had startled them, leaping out suddenly like a jack-in-the-box. The reality was more slow-moving, more like a slug in a box. Unpleasant, certainly. Inconvenient, definitely, but hardly emerging fast enough to be startling. The evidence on climate change has been there, growing steadily for almost 20 years, and any corporate executive doing proper due diligence and scenario planning could have understood the implications. Unfortunately, many fell victim to a well-financed and deliberate campaign of distortion, doubt and denial. Some, it must be said, fell victim willingly. It was the novelist Upton Sinclair who once quipped that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it. By late 1995, in its second assessment report, the IPCC was even more adamant, concluding that the balance of evidence suggested there's a discernible human influence on climate. This statement 13 years ago rang alarm bells in Europe, and many European governments responded accordingly. By contrast, in Australia, our previous government channeled its energies into making sure Australia didn't pull its weight under the Kyoto Protocol. After achieving a spectacular own goal in the Kyoto negotiations, it put it on its comfortable slippers and relaxed by the warm glow of coal-fired power stations for the next decade. Now we're paying the price. Now we have to work harder to try and claw back some of that time. Now we have no time for delays. As Professor Garneau said in his recent draft report, the good options on mitigation will soon be gone. Last year, as Graham has discussed, the IPCC submitted its fourth assessment report, declaring that the warming of climate is unequivocal. It noted that global temperatures have increased by about 0.8 degrees since pre-industrial times, and that because of what we've already put into the atmosphere, we've got another 0.6 on the way. Future emissions therefore guarantee that we're going to sail very close to at least 2 degrees of warming unless emissions are drastically reduced. But why should 2 degrees become the focus of the temperature we focus on? Certainly not because it's safe, not at all. There are very serious consequences even for 2 degrees of warming. But 2 degrees is generally acknowledged as about the lowest we can hope for, given the overwhelming momentum of the international economic system is currently on track to send us well beyond that. There's widespread agreement that the consequences of more than 2 degrees are just too awful to contemplate. So in 2007, the European Commission drew a line in the sand and recommended the EU adopt policies that avoid that threshold. So what does 2 degrees temperature target imply for emissions? Well, as Robin mentioned, the IPCC's best estimate is to prevent global warming above 2 degrees. The rich countries have to reduce their emissions by 25 to 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. And by 80 to 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. At the moment, the debate in Australia does not give due weight to what particular emissions targets imply for warming temperatures, or what the consequences of those temperatures are. You may have noted that the government's current policy of 60% reductions in Australia's emissions below 2000 levels by 2050 falls well short of what's required of rich countries to keep warming close to 2 degrees. The government's current target's a good start, but it's not enough. If it was adopted by all the rich countries, it would bring us warming of more like 3 degrees. So what would a 3-degree increase in temperature mean, and what does it imply for developing countries and for geopolitical stability? Well, for one thing, there are staggering risks in imagining that we can simply weigh up the costs and benefits and target a particular temperature above 2 degrees, like 3 degrees, for example, as being more practical, more sensible, more economically responsible. Such an approach is naive. The Earth's climate is not so simple a system that we can presume to be able to coast to a soft landing at a temperature of our choosing. Instead, it is a highly complex, non-linear system with interacting dynamic feedback paths and critical thresholds. One of the most significant dangers of crossing the 2-degree warming threshold is that we will unleash an avalanche of self-reinforcing processes that guarantee that we'll reach much higher temperatures and much higher sea levels no matter what we do. In other words, 2.5 or 3 degrees of warming may lead inexorably to 4 degrees, 5 degrees, or even 6 degrees as the rainforests dry out and burn, as the Arctic ice disappears, allowing the Arctic Ocean to absorb more and more heat, and the tundras of northern Russia and Canada thaw out, releasing millions of tonnes of carbon dioxide and methane. I find it astonishing as an economist that such reckless radicalism is permitted to march brazenly, unchallenged, under the banners of conservatism and economic responsibility. What does this all mean for developing countries? Well, the poor are currently suffering and will continue to suffer the most from climate change. They are the least able to protect themselves from its effects, and they're least able to recover from climatic disasters. They tend to live in the most vulnerable areas, such as low-lying land prone to flooding or marginal agricultural land prone to drought. They're the most vulnerable to the spread of tropical diseases. They're more likely to have to leave their homes in search of water or to escape flooding. They are the most vulnerable to the effects of the conflicts likely to arise from tensions over water, energy, and displaced people. Women and children in particular are highly vulnerable. There are critical gender dimensions to climate change that are too often forgotten. Women do most of the water fetching in poor countries. Women do most of the agricultural labour. Women do most of the fuel wood gathering. The burden on poor women is likely to increase substantially. So what are some of the projections for developing countries? Let me simply read some of the quotes from last year's IPCC reports. And as I do, try not to let this just wash over you. See their faces, hear their voices, imagine yourself in their place. So what did the IPCC say? Well, it said the drought-affected areas will likely increase in extent. Heavy precipitation events, which are very likely to increase in frequency, will augment flood risk. Many millions more people are projected to be flooded every year due to sea level rise by the 2080s. In Africa, by 2020, between 75 and 250 million people are projected to be exposed to increased water stress due to climate change. Agricultural production, including access to food in many African countries, is projected to be severely compromised. In some countries, yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50% by 2020. In Asia, glacier melt in the Himalayas is projected to increase flooding and rock avalanches from destabilised slopes and to affect water resources within the next 2 decades. This will be followed by decreased river flows as the glaciers recede. Freshwater availability in Central, South and East and Southeast Asia is projected to decrease due to climate change, which could adversely affect more than 1 billion people by the 2050s. It's projected that crop yields could increase by up to 20% in East and Southeast Asia, while they could decrease by up to 30% in Central and South Asia by the mid-21st century. So a decrease in crop yields of 30% potentially in India. Small islands are, of course, especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change, sea level rise and extreme events. It's worth paying particular attention to those projections for Asia. The humanitarian and security implications of widespread water shortages across Turkey, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, northern India, Western China are enormous. The costs are likely to be staggering. Widespread food and water shortages would trigger large movements of people and, if history is any guide, major armed conflicts. In short, climate change will exacerbate poverty and will act as a threat multiplier, greatly increasing the risk of conflict. If climate change continues, as the IPCC has projected, hundreds of millions of poor men and women and vulnerable children will suffer.